Et nous allons lutter.
Bonsoir à tous.
Bonsoir.
Tonight we have a very special invite, Axel Persson from CGT, secrétaire général de CGT, cheminot de Trappes. Did I pronounce it correct?
Very good. Your French is excellent.
Merci. And we'll speak about the, how can we call them, riots or revolts in France?
Yeah, the wave of revolts, strikes, demonstrations. Yes, wave of resistance.
We are resistance. Because I think our media is not very keen for it, to cover it. So we have actually not much information about it. Why not asking directly the people who are demonstrating there? So Axel,
that is a very good optic.
Yeah. What can you tell me about the actual protest? I mean, you are from the syndicates.
Yes.
So you organize the protests.
Yes, I'm from, as you mentioned, I'm a member and an activist within the CGT trade union, which is a trade union that is more or less leading the current wave of strikes that are being organized right now in France. And they have begun now in September, because as many countries across the world, both in Europe, but in most continents across the world, working people are faced with the same issues, which are rising cost of living, high inflation, and wages are not evolving at the same rate as inflation, despite the fact that the major corporations in France, but also across the world, are making record profits. So what happened in September is that the workers within the oil refineries, where there are several oil refineries in France and one in the Antilles, which is in the Caribbean Sea. Some of them are owned by the French multinational Total, some others owned by the American ExxonMobil and Esso. And those workers went on strike, given the fact that their wages hadn't evolved according to inflation, and despite the fact that their corporations had made record-breaking profits. For example, the French Total Corporation has made only during the first semester, which means the first month of the year, raked in more than 10 billion euros in profits, which means that by the end of the year, they will probably reach around 20 billions of euros in terms of profits. And despite these huge profits, the shareholders and their boss decided to hand out huge dividends for the shareholders, but decided to freeze the wage of the workers and refuse to engage into negotiations to raise those wages, and explain to them that they would need to wait eventually next year, and that if there would be a wage increase, it would not be it would pale in comparison to what the shareholders had cashed in. So these oil workers in the refineries started by making warning strikes of 24-hour strikes and then 72-hour strikes. And as the company refused to budge, they decided in late September, and they seized the occasion that the CGT trade union called for, when the CGT trade union called for a general strike across all industries. The oil refinery workers decided that from that date on, they would not return back to work after the 29th of September until their demands were met. So after 10 or 11 days approximately, since the oil that is being imported was not being refined, after 10 to 11 days, well, the consequences got very visible, because there were fuel shortages all across the country. I, for example, couldn't find any petrol for my own car to only get to work or just to move around, and so was the case for many industries and many people who just needed to use their cars. So other workers faced with the same issue saw that the oil refinery workers were going on a massive offensive strike, and it gave ideas to other workers, such as railway workers, workers who work in the metal industry, workers in the retail industry, logistics, were started to think that, okay, the oil refinery workers are leading the way, we should join them. And this was what has been happening in France for the past week now. And what really sparked the general anger, which led to a general strike only a few days ago on the 18th of October, was that as the oil companies were being forced gradually to retreat against the striking workers, the government intervened and ordered not all, but ordered approximately 10 to 20 of these workers back to work. And they sent the police officers to their homes after almost 1 month of strike and told them, you go back to work or we'll send you to prison and we'll make you pay fines, which of course revolted many sections of the working class in the railway, in the metal industry. So that's when we decided very quickly to react as a class, as a trade union, of course, but also as a working class as a whole, united defend our right to strike with our comrades in the refineries. And that's what happened on the 18th of October. As the government tried to force the oil workers back to work, the working class responded as a united front and said, we'll all go on strike, not only in support of the oil refinery workers, but also to demand that our demands, which are the same as the oil workers, be satisfied. So that's what happened on the 18th of October. And as the strike is starting to fade away in the oil refineries because they managed to achieve some of their demands, not all, but a significant part of them. Now other workers are entering the strike and are organizing their own strikes. And for example, us in the railway, we are now preparing for a massive, probably general open-ended strike, much in the same model as the refinery workers, to impose and win higher wages that will allow us to survive in this context of inflation. And that what is happening in the railway is happening across all industries in France now. And we as a trade union are trying to generalize those strikes and go to the offensive against the employers and the government. So that is what is happening in France right now.
Yes, I'm curious, is there a law in the French legislation to force people, like you said, to go with the police and bring them to work?
Well,
What's the legal basis?
Well, it has existed in it exists in for hospital workers, fire workers, and some services which are essential to keep people alive, like hospital workers or fire workers. This is one of the rare times when it has been used against oil workers because theoretically, it's supposed to be used to prevent a massive threat to public health or public disorder. And but we all know that despite the fact that the law theoretically says that when it comes to class struggle, in the end, it's not really the law that matters. It's because in the end of the day, they have the police officers with their guns, with their batons, and they will use brute force when they feel that their interests are threatened to the core. So they don't have a really legal basis. They just basically make them up as they go, because that is the reality of class struggle. And that is also why we, of course, we responded within the courts, knowing full well that we would probably lose in court. And that is why also we decided that the best response to people threatening our right to strike would be to expand the strikes all across the country, which means that the government has pretty much lost its bet because he thought that ordering back a few strikers back to work would end the strikes. But what it has really actually ignited is the generalization of strikes all across both public and private industries, which opens up for a very interesting situation for militant workers such as myself, who have been waiting for an opportunity like this to take the offensive.
Yes. It was just a few days ago, we had a book presentation by Albena Asmanova from Bulgaria.
Mm-hmm.
And she was actually she wrote a book about the crisis of capitalism. And I see this relating to the protest. Because you mentioned that your protests are somehow motivated by the fact that okay, the company had the huge profits, and these profits should be shared with the employee. And isn't this actually like a tuning of the capitalism and not actually a strike against capitalism? I mean, where is the separation between I mean, a protest against capitalism and a protest to live better in capitalism?
There's a fine line that is drawn, because I would say it would be, of course, a bit ambitious and maybe not true to say that every striking worker who goes on strike is consciously striking against capitalism. Because when you go on strike, there's a wide array of workers who go on strike. Not all of them are necessarily ideologically on par and at the same level. However, in the current period, given the current situation where the past years that have passed in France, much like in the rest of the world with COVID, where there have been shutdowns, lockdowns, and where people have seen that those who have kept society running are working people, ordinary working people, not the shareholders, not the bank owners, not the capital owners, who, when the society were completely locked down, either fled to their secondary luxurious home by the seaside, or just stayed at home doing nothing. Those who kept society running were people in the retail industry, keeping the shops open, truck drivers. Those who keep society running are workers. And the shareholders, capital owners are in fact quite parasitical in terms of society, because they disappeared all of a sudden, almost from the day to the next, and society survived, and actually survived better without them. So many people have come to a realization that, of course, there have been injustices, but also fundamentally that there is something wrong in terms not only of distribution of wealth, but also who actually detains the real power and who should be exerting real power within society. Those who make it run, those who work and create the wealth, or should they be the one deciding on how to use the wealth and how we should distribute it? Or should it be only those who own the capital but who do not contribute to creating anything? And we as activists, of course, in these strikes, of course, we also as any workers just need to defend our living conditions. And that is also part of our motives. But what we are trying to highlight now in these strikes is that it should not only be a strike for higher wages, which is, of course, an important aspect, but it is also a way to demonstrate that those who make society run are workers, because when we stop working, nothing works. And that's a demonstration. So the conclusion we are trying to spread amongst working people is that if society can't run without you, it means you should be the one exerting power. You should be the one deciding in the workplace. Because what is completely absurd in workplaces is that we have, for example, achieved trade union rights through our struggles across the centuries. In France, even workers can elect. I was elected by my fellow workers as a trade union representative. And even despite the fact that I am elected with other comrades, of course, I'm not the only one, with other comrades, when we see the management and the boss, we are the one who are elected, but we are not the one who detaining the power. We only have the right to transmit the demands of the workers, but we don't have a say on how to run the company, on how to use the wealth. Those who have that power are people who sit in front of us and are less than us and are not elected, which poses a political problem on who is detaining the power. So what we are trying to demonstrate in these strikes is not only that it is an effective tool to defend your interest, but it is also a profound critique on how capitalism works, and that it is not only a problem of how to share wealth between shareholders and workers, but that it highlights the fact that political power is not exerted by those who should be exerting it. And I also think that it is absolutely necessary to defend that perspective, because given the current crisis, not only the economical crisis, but also the climate crisis, which can be directly linked to the consequences of the destructive nature of capitalism, if we want to solve that problem, we will need to take political control over this tiny lighted minority that runs the economy according to their own narrow-minded interests that don't care about, for example, the climate, because as long as it doesn't is not aligned with their profit making, they will not care about it. So we will need to eliminate them politically in order to assert control over society and even save humanity. It might actually sound a bit like far-fetched or pompous, but it's not really, because if we want to save humanity, at one point, humanity will have to realize that we will have to radically change the political system in which we live in. Otherwise, we're just going to continue going straight and head towards that wall everybody knows we're heading towards, but that for some reason we just keep heading towards, even though we know there's a catastrophe that has already started, that has already begun. In some aspects, it's already perhaps a bit too late, but we all know we're heading in front of this wall where we're just all going to crash and suffer severe consequences unless we rise up and manage to take control not only over our own lives, but over entire society. And that's what we're trying to at least defend in these strikes.
Yes, it was Slavoj Žižek who was saying that it's easier to imagine the end of world than the end of capitalism. So it's actually a problem imagining the end of capitalism. I've seen a slogan at your protest: "La force de travailleur, c'est la grève."
Exactly.
Very, very fun, very nice. But you had elections recently. So how you tried to change politically? I mean, Mélenchon didn't manage to win elections. Why people didn't support him?
Well, there are many different reasons because as we see that society is becoming increasingly polarized, violent, people are looking for alternatives. Of course, there are a section of society that defends and thinks that either that the current system is good or that it's the least worst possible. And that part of society, a majority not amongst workers or poor people, amongst mostly middle management, better well off, including some employees within, for example, offices that are a bit more paid off, for now at least, might identify with the current society and say it's the least worst possible option. Those would basically are the ones who would vote and support Macron. But that's a minority actually,
but Macron was voted by a majority.
Well, actually, if you look at the political system in France, it's a bit more complicated than that because he actually never got the majority in terms of votes. Actually, it showed really well during the legislative elections because in France, there are two elections, one for the president of the republic, and just 2 months after follows the election for the parliament. Yes. And Macron won the election because the second candidate who got to the second round was Marine Le Pen from the far right. And for now, at least, the vast majority of society rejects the far right. It's gotten stronger. They're getting more organized. You can see that racist, xenophobical ideas are progressing in society, but that it's still being rejected by a majority of society. So it's a pretty easy candidate for him to beat right now. Basically, there's a saying that goes amongst that basically even a sheep would win against Le Pen in the second round of the election. Even a goat would win against her. But it might be less true, though, in 5 years now. It might be less true. It's been true for like 30 years now, but it might be less true now because, as you can see in the rest of Europe, the far right is progressing and in some countries is getting to government. So what we've been saying as a joke for the past year might not be true in a few years. But on the other hand, the far right has managed to capitalize on the anger that has expressed in society and has formulated basically a political theory that has been saying that all the causes of the crisis in society, be it unemployment, insecurity, low wages, they just deny climate change, so they just don't talk about it. But basically every problem in society that they recognize, they basically say it's not the fault of capitalism. It's not the fault of the system. It's the fault of immigrants or Muslims or I don't know. Sometimes depending on the current, sometimes the LGBT community. It depends. But basically, it's the fault of minorities, like ethnic minorities or religious minorities. And they say basically, if we want to solve the problem, well, we're just going to have to attack them, deprive them of rights. It works some parts of the population, and they're presenting it. The political theory of the far right is presenting it not as a crisis of capitalism, but as a crisis of civilization. That it would be a battle ongoing between society with Christian heritage that would be threatened by mostly Muslims. Some say Jews, but that's what they used to say like 60 or 70 years ago. Nowadays, it's more Muslims, and they say the problem is not capitalism. It's not the crisis of capitalism. It's an ongoing civilizational battle between a Christian society and a Muslim society. And on the other hand, there are currents within the left. Mélenchon has managed to capitalize most of it, even though he's more or less a reformist. But he's been the left or the far left has been saying another analysis and saying that the problem we are facing now is the crisis of capitalism, and that those who are responsible for the current situation, the warmongering, the war that are spreading across Europe and the world, the low wages, the inflation, is capitalism and the political personnel that serves it. And that those are the one we need to overthrow, and we need to unite across ethnicity as a class to defend ourselves all together and overthrow them. So the question will be, who will win between these two political options, because I take it for more or less a given, even though, well, in politics, nothing is ever certain, that the crisis is going to develop so intensively that there will be very little political space for those who defend the current system as it is. So, at the end of the day, it will pan out and play between the far left and the far right. Much as Rosa Luxemburg said almost 100 years ago, the option will be very soon socialism or barbarism. And that is something I think we're headed to. I don't know if it's going to be next year, 2 years, 5 years, or 10 years, but it's definitely where we're headed to. This type of violent confrontation where it'll be basically either us or them. That's for sure. And one of us is going to win, one of us is going to lose because there won't be space for the both of us. And but for now, we're not there yet. So for now, Macron still manages to present himself as the one who is he calls himself a barrage or a rempart, which means in French the wall of a castle. He's a castle that is defending against the extremists, both from right and from left, and he aspires to represent the stability and maintain the continued existence of the current order. For now, it works.
Can we choose the castle to be the Bastille?
Yeah, exactly. That's a good analogy, because at the end of the day, the French people have a long history of overthrowing castles and storming prisons,
yes.
like the Bastille. But that's the situation for now. So basically, it's who is gonna win ideologically, who's gonna win practically, and that is also something class activists, communists, socialists, trade unionists have to have in their political compass when they are fighting, because we have to take some height and look beyond just our immediate demands and realize that we are engaged in a major political fight and which the outcome will be crucial for us. And what happens in France quite often in terms of class struggle is also very crucial to the rest of Europe and by extension the rest of the world, given the importance of the French labor movement and the influence it has in the world. So yeah, that is something class conscious activists need to be aware of, and we're trying to make them aware of it at least.
Well, I've seen the problem a bit different here in the East from your description. I mean, because like we've seen Viktor Orban or other right forces from Eastern Europe, they don't identify the problem. I mean, okay, Orban is very Christian in his words and everything, but I haven't seen here a problem about Muslims or immigrants so much in their speech. I mean, in the speech of the right, as it is a speech against the European Union. I mean, the main topic of the right in Eastern Europe is the sovereignist. Is taking hold of the political power over the intervention of the European Union bureaucrats, as they call them. So it's a bit different polarization, and they somehow pose themselves like anti-establishment force, and in some way they capitalize somehow on the left speech. So actually, people who should vote for the left end up voting with the right, which is very, very strange.
Yeah, it's actually not that different in France, because it used to be one of the historical lines, especially the Front National, which is now called Rassemblement National, which is the main far-right party in France. They have toned down their critics of the European Union. For example, they advocated leaving it, but now they're not advocating leaving it. They're advocating leaving Euro, but they changed over the past year just to focus more basically on, just to put it simply, whites being attacked by people who are not white. That's now they're concentrating more on that, and they have to defend the nation from immigrants. But they have toned down quite a lot the critics of the European Union, but much like actually the far right actually in Hungary or even in Poland, because they regularly say that, but none of them have ever taken a step to leave the European Union, for example. They've never taken a step to actually do it. And so much of it is quite theatrical, because sometimes we see that also in here in France, that of course we as communists have no illusion in the European Union or NATO or any of the alliances the capitalists have built in order to maintain their military dominance or their economical dominance over workers. But sometimes we also see that, for example, far right forces or even some right wing forces will use the EU as an excuse and say, oh, we're not responsible for it. It was the EU who did it. But at the end of the day, they're the one also making the decisions, especially in countries like France or Germany, who are basically the big players and those calling the shots in the European Union because they are the biggest economies. Nobody is forcing them to take these decisions because, for example, if they choose not to apply them, nobody will send an army and shoot them and remove them from power. Everything is voluntary. It's a voluntary compliance to a common set of rules the different employers and bourgeoisie across Europe have agreed upon. Of course, they sometimes are in competition, but they have agreed on a common set of rules and a common set of rules in which they will compete against each other. So they all voluntarily agree to it. And it's true that sometimes it works because the critique of the European Union, even though we also make one, sometimes is also a way to not make a critique of capitalism in itself. It's just a way of critiquing one of its aspects, one of its narrow aspects, which is the European Union. But for example, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, left Brexit, but they didn't leave capitalism. The capitalists are still there, the shareholders are still there, and they're still attacking workers as violently as they were before. So we have, of course, a radical critique of the European Union, but we will not make it the only scapegoat because our target is capitalism as a whole. The problem will not solve the problems we have won't solve themselves magically just because we leave the European Union. That's what we're trying to say, at least from our class perspective. And we also note that all the far right forces who have taken power in Eastern Europe, they haven't left the European Union, which means that they have pledged allegiance to them. Even Viktor Orban, he may do a lot of theater. He may put himself like play some drama about it. But at the end of the day, he will stay in the European Union because that's what the bosses in Hungary have dictated him to do. So he will abide by that. Maybe maybe in a few years it will change, but it won't be him who will be deciding it. It will be the Hungarian employers.
Okay, so we talked about the right, and I think it was Alain Badiou who said that tout ce qui bouge n'est pas rouge, right?
Yeah, everything that moves is not red.
Yes. Yeah. Was it people who identify themselves politically with the right present in these protests these days?
In the current protests right now, I mean, those are very organized within the working class, but the working class is diverse. So it is the current protests. I mean, those we're talking about in September. I mean, the current ones are protests that have emerged from organized working class industrial industries, working class industries, and as such are led by trade union activists, and they are the one who are leading it politically and ideologically. But that doesn't mean that all of those who are on strike are necessarily communists or socialists or whatever. Of course, there are some people, probably even some people who might actually vote for the far right, but most of workers just do not vote anymore. But that's what's interesting with strikes, is that it unites working people, working class, around class demands, and force them to unite around a class perspective and use tools that are specific to the working class, which are strikes. And as such, it helps to progress class consciousness. The far right has little influence in the current movement, and actually the far right political parties have been condemning the strikes because they've been saying, oh, the oil refinery workers are taking the French people to ransom because we can't fill petrol in our cars. So they have been denouncing the strikes and criticizing them quite violently and asking actually the government to order striking workers back to work, which shows how in the end of the day they are linked to capital as well, and that they in the end of the day aspire to rule society according to the same interests as those who are currently in power. But I understand what Alain Badiou meant. If I recall correctly, he said that during the Yellow Vest movement, which happened 3 years ago, which was actually a very interesting and quite new movement for us in France, because it emerged like quite spontaneously. It organized through social network, and it got quite a widespread audience. But since it did not emerge from the traditional organized working class districts, basically, it attracted quite a lot of people with very diverse political opinions. And at the beginning, the demands were essentially focused on taxes on petrol. So it was, of course, many people could recognize in it, because people would say, oh, we as workers, we feel that we are paying way too much for the petrol in our car just to go to work, and as such expressed a critique of the system. But it was at the beginning very narrowly aimed at only the issues of taxes, which is sometimes also something the right or the far right regularly critiques, because that's one of their main political propaganda, is to say that if you have low wages, if you have bad living conditions, it's not because you have low wages in itself. It's not because bosses underpay you compared to the wealth you create. It's because you pay too much taxes, and because there are too much social rights in the country, because there are too many people who have pensions, because unemployed get benefits, because sick people get benefits if they're sick. And so that's the regular critique the far right does, and says that in order for you to live better, you need to pay less taxes, and they try to make you believe that by paying less taxes, that basically you will be better off, which is also, when you listen, the same thing that the bosses say, because the bosses will always be going on in the media and saying, oh, we pay too much taxes, we have to pay too much for the pensions, you have too much paid holidays, if you're sick, it's not normal that you get sick, that we have to pay you if you're sick. And this whole idea of you even retiring is a political heresy for them, because it literally means for them paying workers to do nothing, which is like a complete contradiction in their own mind, in their own mind. So the yellow vest in the beginning attracted people from all these type of political opinions, but as the movement deepened and continued, it evolved, because then clearer demands were made for higher wages, the defense of public services, and also it emerged a critique of how political power was exerted in France and detained in France. Because one of the demands that emerged, one I personally think is an illusion, but nevertheless, it underscored and stressed how the question of political powers was placed in this movement. Because one of the main demands that started to emerge was what they called RIC, which means in French, Référendum d'initiative citoyenne, which means that one of the demands was that citizens should be able to call for a referendum in order to force parliament or the president to either impose a law, reject a law, and it was a way for them to express that they wanted to find a tool to have political direct power, which they felt completely deprived of. I think that their conclusion, which is just to be able to organize a referendum, is an illusion. But nevertheless, it does show that the question of who exercised political power was present also in this movement. And so the yellow velvet, it's true that not everything that moves is red. That is true, and we've seen that in other examples. For example, in Chile, when the coup that overthrew Allende happened, of course, it was a military coup, but it was preceded by, for example, what we could assimilate to strikes by truckers, by truck drivers, who were basically paid by the companies and also by the CIA to organize a strike that would cripple Allende. So it's true that not everything that moves is red. But specifically in France, for the past, what is positive is that in the past movements we've seen this past year is that it has shown that there's a class consciousness in this country and that it has progressed. It doesn't mean we have won the ideological battle on all points, but it has underscored that there is a class consciousness in this country and that it is trying to express and organize itself.
Yes. I was wondering, especially you said about Chile, we can look all over the place, like Brazil now, which has been a very big surprise for the people expecting great results from the left. It looks like a falling of the left. I'm not sure if you can make a prediction, like say, or an analysis. Is it left going upward, or I mean, is it rising? Is it increasing in power, or rather falling compared to the power of the sovereignist right? So let's call it like this.
Well, those who have the advantage right now, the political advantage, are without a question of a doubt the far right. That's
Yes.
without a question of a doubt. Even in France, they're the one who most capitalizing it in terms, at least, of election-wise. Socially, in terms of influence and social mobilization, not so much. But in terms of like political elections, without a question of a doubt, is the far right that is progressing. But what has been shown also in the past years now, is that the old traditional left in France that was essentially represented by the Socialist Party has completely disappeared now. In France, the two main parties that alternated according to the different elections, that after 5 years or 7 years, it was one who won the election and the other one was the Socialist Party on one hand and the traditional Gaullist right party, which used to be called RPR and then UMP, and now it's called Les Républicains. But it's the same party. And those two parties who used to switch between each other have completely disappeared from the national politics. During the last presidential election, these two parties who have been sharing power for the past 70 years now, 60 years now in France, barely poll 1.5 or even 7% in the election. And the far right is now polling way higher. And also the left that has more or less been aggregated around Mélenchon is polling almost as high as the far left in the first round of the election. Not necessarily, not quite as much, but very close by. And so it's a new left that is emerging. It doesn't mean that all the new politicians are new, but it's new formation, new organizations. And there seems also to be, even on the left, a renewed interest for the idea of social transformation that is also gaining momentum. But so far, both are gaining momentum, but the far right is the one who is a bit more advanced in terms of positions and influence. But there is also, for example, to make it very concrete, if you look at just the election results, the first lesson is that the majority of working people and young people do not vote. That's the first thing. We have to remember it before we analyze the result. The majority do not work, do not vote, and express their discontent at the system or their apathy, their indifference by not voting. That's the majority of them. But amongst those who vote, for example, amongst young people, the far right is actually quite behind. So it means that the new generation that is coming up is very majority, for example, voted for Jean-Luc Mélenchon, but by a very large majority. It's not even narrow. He was like way ahead. And amongst working class people, unfortunately, even though the majority does not vote, you can see that the far right is more represented than the new left that is emerging, even though the new left is also closing in close by. For example, in all the big working class cities, but the big cities, the new left is way ahead, especially in the working class communities where there are a lot of immigrant workers or descendants from immigrant workers, like around Paris, Marseille, or the big cities where you have a lot of working class people with immigrant backgrounds. The new left that identified around Mélenchon is really far ahead. For example, concrete example, in the city where I work, Trappes, which is in the suburbs, a working class suburb in the southwest of Paris. It used to be a city run by the Communist Party and then the Socialist Party, and it's a very working class, poor neighborhood. Jean-Luc Mélenchon scored sometimes 70% of the votes
Wow.
in the first round. So in those type of areas, he's really far ahead. But in the countryside, it's a bit different. In the countryside, it's a bit different. There, the far right has much stronger positions and gives them this edge they have over this current left. So it's a really intense battle. It's a very tight race in which the far right is running a bit ahead, but in which they have this new left that is emerging and that is running behind them, but not that far behind. So the question will be to know in the coming years who is going to capitalize on the current political situation and who is going to be able to convince basically a social majority to join them basically.
Yes.
So that is the current situation.
Yes, I mean, I think most of our calculations are based on some predictions we made before, or let's say not aware of our main crisis, which is what's happening in the East, in the Eastern War. and which is very much affecting our European economy, and I suppose also the lifestyle of all, mostly of people who are working class. They are the most affected. And when I watch, for example, about the protest in Paris on the Euronews, they showed people, mostly people from the street, like gathering and protesting against the rising prices. And they talked about grapes, they talked about vegetables, and I mean, their basic needs, not necessarily some class conscience and salaries. So I think people are very aware of a big crisis which is affecting them, not necessarily as a conflict with companies and bureaucrats and bosses, but a crisis provoked by this conflict. So I'm wondering if we put in our calculations this coming crisis, which probably will be unfolding in the following months and affecting our economy. What do you think people would what would change in people mentality? I mean, right can very easily say, okay, it's not everything that happens is because of Putin, so we can capitalize on that, and so it's not a problem of the system, it's not capitalism, it's Putin.
Yeah, that's of course the line. Even Macron is currently that's what he's saying, and that's actually the line the government and even the right, the traditional right in France are saying, is that the problem is only the war in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, and that most or less the rising cost of living is explained more or less only by that. It's not because we as Marxists, we try to explain, and people can hear that because you compare inflation and you compare the soaring profits. I mean, the profits that are being raked in right now are beating records in France. I don't know about the other countries, but because I haven't like analyzed it as closely as I have in France, but in France, the major corporations, those who are in the stock markets, they have literally been beating records that are like historical. That's never been beaten before. So the inflation is not a natural catastrophe. It's a decision that is being made by employers, by bosses, by banks, in order to say, how do we do to maximize our profits or to preserve them? We do it by raising our prices and making sure that we do not pay for the consequences of the wars we have decided to engage in ourselves. So it's a conscious decision that people make in the companies, in the banks. They say, they take these decisions. And that is what we are trying to say, because people say, but what do you want them to do? Well, we answer, well, rather than making you pay more, yes, we're gonna take on the profits. It'll mean less profits, less for the shareholders, less for the banks. That is true, but it will mean more for your living conditions, more for your public services, more for your pensions, more for your hospitals. But that is the political choice we make. They are making the other choice. They say we have to organize everything, even the price settings, according to our interests, which is to preserve our profits. And that is how capitalism works. And we are making that critique of the system. And of course, our adversaries, our political adversaries, are saying, "Oh, well, you understand, they don't have a choice. They have to make you pay for the crisis, basically. We're very sorry, but we don't have a choice." We're saying, no, we have a choice as a society on who is going to pay the crisis. We don't think we are the one who should be paying for it.
Yes. So let's end it with an optimistic tone. So can we expect Bastille anytime soon? Let's say a siege of the capitalist system, or let's make a forecast, like how.
I wouldn't make a forecast. I would hope to, but everything indicates that, not only in France, but that class confrontation is going to get more and more intense. Everything points to that fact. We see it all across the world. Of course, now we talked about France, but we see even in the Middle East, there are protests rising all across the world. Sri Lanka, a government was overthrown actually by workers and peasants. So we see that all across the world, class confrontation is getting more and more intense. So there's no reason that France will be exempt from it. I could say that with reference to the Yellow Vest movement, is that what is also so charming about this country is that it's so unpredictable, so explosive. And for example, I remember when we were doing the Yellow Vest demonstration, because we took part of it as activists, at one point, we actually said, are we dreaming or are we really living this? Because at some points, we were literally demonstrating, and it was like normal working class retirees who were on the Champs-Élysées near the Élysée Palace saying, we're just gonna go get the president and we're gonna go get him physically, and throwing rocks at the police, which indicated to sometimes that even like sometimes our comrades from the union literally stormed ministries, and Macron even had a contingency plan with a helicopter to flee in case they managed to enter it. So they know, and we both know, that things are not necessarily predictable, but we know that all the conditions are met now for a social explosion to happen. Will it happen in 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, next year? I don't know. But everything tends to point to the fact that a major showdown will happen soon.
I hope you are right. And
I hope so too.
Yeah, thank you very much for the interview. And
thank you for having me.
We'll hope to have more news from France. And I mean, French always led the social and working revolutions all over the world. I mean, and maybe they will lead again. And
maybe
we have a lot of expectations and hopes from the French left. Thank you very much, Axel.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.